Hello again. Welcome to Modern Western Buddhism. I'm Jared Jones. It's good to see you again. So today I wanted to talk about a topic that I think is fundamental to studying and training in Buddhism in the West. And it's also a topic that I think in general doesn't receive enough attention. And this is extremely unfortunate because without a really robust way of engaging the material that one hears in a Dharma setting, the way of making progress is quite unclear. And one of the complaints that I quite frequently hear from Western Dharma students is that, in essence, maybe they're 4 years in, 5 years in, some people 10 years in, and they go, I've heard a lot of teachings, I've attended some retreats, I've heard a little bit from this tradition, a little bit from that tradition. I have perhaps attended weekend courses where so-and-so Rinpoche came into town and he was teaching this topic, and so we learned about the Heart Sutra. Great. And then so-and-so Rinpoche came into town and we learned about compassion. Awesome. And then so on and so on and so on. You find that a lot of Western students of Asian systems in general, but in particular Buddhism, and my most extensive experiences with Tibetan Buddhism and the Gelug tradition, one tends to find that there is a really disjointed sort of learning process that's going on. If you were apprenticing as a window maker, right? I worked for a brief time in a factory that made doors and windows. The very first thing you're going to do is the first thing. You're going to start with the first machine. You're going to learn, this is how the pieces of wood are cut from sort of, from this shape into the shape that's needed to make a glazing, right? To make a glaze. You start from the very bottom, the very foundational work as an apprentice, and you slowly work your way up. You slowly get to put your hands on more complicated pieces of machinery, and so on, right? I mean, that's the natural process of mentorship and learning that should be happening in any type of apprenticeship. Unfortunately, because the Dharma model in the West, by and large, is a model of sort of a paid course, the apprenticeship model that would be taking place, for example, in a monastic environment is by and large absent. So really for us, what this means is that we have to find ways and means of recapturing the essence of that apprenticeship type model so that we can really make progress in the same way that we might if we had a more formal mentorship going on. And for those of us who have had a real mentorship in Buddhism, the idea of doing Buddhism without some type of mentorship is just absurd. It's insane. So then the question becomes, okay, you've been involved in Buddhism for a couple of years or 5 years or 10 years. Why is it that you still feel like you haven't made a ton of progress, that when people ask you pointed questions about certain Dharma topics, you don't have a definition of the relevant terms involved in your own training ready at hand? Whereas if you had been working in a factory for 10 years making windows, you would have like an encyclopedic knowledge of, well, yes, I remember for 2 years when I was working on just the poles that go in the in the glazing and when I was working on the frame and when I was cutting glass. I remember all of the pieces, everything that everyone told me about each stage of the process. And I could very easily explain this to someone who hasn't been doing this for very long. And yet, there are people who have been training in Buddhism in general, but in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, for a decade. And they can't tell you what mindfulness is from a Gelug perspective, for example, if you were trained in the Gelug. But all of the Buddhist systems are relying on Abhidharma when it comes to things like mindfulness, introspection, aversion, attachment, ignorance. Ignorance may be a bit more subtle because there's so many definitions to choose from, but in any case, the main definitions for all of these mental states is going to be the same from school to school. So then the question becomes, after having trained in this for as long as you have, why is it, if you're finding yourself in this case, why is it that in your mind there's not some sort of graded sequential set of steps that is fairly ready at hand? It's because the way it was presented to you wasn't in really a graded sequential series of steps. It was presented to you in sort of a ad hoc, here's a weekend course, here's another weekend course, here's a 1-month retreat, here's this, here's that. And so your sense of the entire path and how to get from A to Z was never fully formed in that way. Now, admittedly, in my mind, I find the Tibetan systems, and in particular the Gelug, extremely rigorous in this regard when it comes to things like Lam Rim. So on paper, we could say the systematization of these teachings is just astonishing if you read the texts and if you're being taught the text in a systematic way. Not only that, there are incredible courses, for example, through FPMT, where one can do 2 years or 5 years or 7 years that are quite demanding and take you from soup to nuts, from appetizers to dessert. They take you through the entire path in extremely rigorous detail. However, the traditional model for learning these things it really doesn't match that type of environment either. Because, for example, if you were going to train as a Gelug monastic, you would be expected to memorize the root texts. You would be expected to memorize the texts that you are using to then go to the debate courtyard, and you'd be expected to recite those on the debate courtyard, and somebody would be challenging you on all of the points of those texts on a regular basis. So where is that process in the Western world? Right? It's nowhere to be found. So if you're thinking about really trying to figure out the Buddhist path, really trying to figure out, okay, here's the practice I'm engaged in, here are all the nuts and bolts, here's how they fit together, here's how this practice takes me from A to B, and from B to C, and C to D, and so on, then you have to have some type of systematic way of approaching the teachings from the outset, right? Where you're genuinely digesting each piece as you go. And you need to have some ongoing process where you are trying to connect the dots at higher and higher levels in your own understanding. Because as you're going to see, I hope, in today's, I don't even know what to call it. I'm just calling it a course, because I'm not anyone's guru, I'm not anyone's mentor, I'm not anyone's really anything. A friend of mine said that in the Chinese traditions, sometimes they have a position that's almost like an older brother, right? It's not someone who's really qualified to teach you the whole path. but it's someone who's been doing it a bit longer than you have, perhaps, in some cases. And it can be helpful to have someone to ruffle your hair and elbow you in the ribs, right? Maybe that's where I fit in. But my real passion, that's been growing for quite some time, is to really, really try to help European and American students in particular, or at least people who have deep influences, maybe even due to colonialism, of, sort of the global modern culture thing. And give them a set of tools to digest these teachings in a legitimate way and really to train in their own lineage better. I don't think that it's so important whether you're training in the Thai forest tradition or you're training in Rinzai or Soto Zen. I don't think it's all that important whether you're training in those versus one of the Tibetan systems or the Korean systems or you name it. I don't think that's that important. It's unbelievably fortunate that we have so many different lineages that are quite helpful. So my position, my intent is not to convert anyone out of this system and into that system and so on. My intent is to help people who aren't going to train in traditional monastic environments and aren't going to move into caves to really dive more deeply into their traditions, really get the most out of the tradition that they're already involved in. So in that regard, the model that I'm going to share today is quite helpful. It's very, very helpful. And give me just a moment. I'm going to pull up my notes. Sometimes technology is great. Other times technology is not so great. So today, what I'd like to talk about is the threefold division that you find in numerous Tibetan presentations of Buddha Dharma, which can be translated in numerous ways, but in essence it means that you have heard the teachings or you have studied the teachings basically once or twice. And so you have this rough familiarity with the teachings. The second phase is that you have not only sort of heard it and remembered some of it, but now you're starting to digest it and contemplate it and draw the connections in your own mind, where you've realized it's not sufficient just to really, even just to have memorized the teachings verbatim, right? That's not sufficient. Because you could have I used to sing opera, for example, and you can learn an Italian aria verbatim, and you can sing it in Italian verbatim without understanding a word of what you're saying. You can have every tone just perfect and it sings, and if you sing it to other people, you might bring tears to their eyes and you have no clue what the connection of the first word is to the second. You have no clue what the first sentence means relative to the last sentence, or if there's any poetic devices going. You have none of this. You're just singing. So no matter how beautifully you can sing the Dharma, no matter how easily the Dharma comes to mind, there's a difference to simply having the correct sort of verbal formula to reply to a teacher, for example, if they were asking you a question, and actually being able to explain that set of words that you just uttered in a way that really demonstrates that you have an understanding of what you're talking about, i.e., to continue with the Italian aria kind of analogy, you can translate what's going on. And perhaps you also have some understanding that, yes, there's a poetic device that's happening between line 1 and line 3, also line 2 and line 4, and then also the first 4 lines have a poetic device that's functioning, yada, yada, yada. And you know all this. That's contemplation. That's stage 2. where not only do you have the right words in your head in the right order, not only do you have sort of a general picture of, yes, these are the right words in the right order, but you can connect them, you can understand those connections. If somebody asks you a novel question, you don't generally get stuck going, right? You look at your own understanding and the connections that you have, and you go, okay, yeah, I never thought about that, but yes, paragraph number 4 actually is connected to number 3, and it's actually for these 7 reasons that, right? Those understandings should flow naturally from an understanding that has been matured through contemplation, right? So finally, there's meditation, and I think this is perhaps the least understood of these 3, because in the Tibetan presentation, there's all sorts of different types of meditation. Generally speaking, they do fit under the 2, right? They fit under the 2 types, calm abiding and vipassana. Calm abiding, special insight. But under special insight, there's a whole host of other little sort of techniques that don't require that you have full calm abiding to do the meditation. Now, some people may be going, oh, no, I've read all this. I understand it. I've never heard of this. What is this? If you read Venerable Pabanka's texts, and in particular the appendices on his works in multiple places, he talks about these other types of meditative techniques that are, in essence, meant to take you from being someone with no meditative capability, 0. Think about this. Who's read the Lam Rim? Who has looked at the pedagogical stages in various Tibetan systems, and for that matter, in the forest traditions, and to a degree in Zen, although Zen is an interesting set of pedagogies. Has an interesting set of pedagogies. At the base level, when you're looking at the study of Buddhism, you're looking at the study of mind training and meditation. Where does training in calm abiding come in the pedagogy? Is it day 1? Is it the first thing you do? No. If we're taking the Gelug system, which is, again, the one that I'm most familiar with, calm abiding comes, it's the last step in an extremely extended process of changing your mind in a legitimate way. It is the second to last step, basically, in a long series of changes that you're making to your mind before you have calm abiding, much less special insight. Are you following me? The entire Lam Rim happens, all of the stages of the path happen basically prior to having calm abiding, prior to being able to generate single-pointed concentration, much less a rarefied type of single-pointed concentration in which you're doing non-conceptual analysis of an object and realizing emptiness or other topics directly. So this then raises the question, well, what type of meditation are we doing exactly to generate things like the proper reliance on a mentor as a meditative topic, or the 4 close placements of mindfulness, or the preciousness of a human rebirth, or gross impermanence, subtle impermanence? There are a whole host of Buddhist topics, understandings, and meditative realizations that occur entirely before you have calm abiding. I can't emphasize this enough. Which, if you've been doing this a while and you haven't heard something like this, should really, really wake you up. If you're sort of waiting until you have single-pointed focus to do the rest of the training, and your main practice is just sitting down and doing 20 minutes of trying to keep your mind on your breath, that's not bad. But at the same time, the things that will bring the practice to fruition, the things that will bring the practice from just the struggle that you have every day to fruition, according to the great masters, are all of these intermediate stages and topics that you train in on the Lamrim path, right? So, how do we proceed from here? I think I'm going to switch over now to the notes, as long as they stay stable. They've been coming in and out, so I've just been chatting with you. Okay, so let's chat quickly. Well, actually not that quickly. Let's really take our time now. I've kind of finished with introductory stuff, and I'd like to really dive deep today on just this one thing. Now, some people may at this stage be going, well, why are we talking about this when we're talking about training in meditation? Well, we're talking about this because meditation will not occur, according to at least the Gelug system, until you can do the rest of this. The reason calm abiding comes at the end of the Lamrim is because you need to have done the Lamrim trainings in order to have the appropriate foundation to generate calm abiding. Now, there may be ways around that using tantric technology, but if you're not a tantric practitioner, or you're not employing some similar type of technology from some other system, then this is the way to go in terms of training in these things. So, where do we begin? So, those who have studied Lamrim will be quite familiar, I think, with the three faults of a vessel. These usually come right at the beginning somewhere of a Lamrim style presentation, a stages of the path style presentation of Buddhist stuff. So really the first thing then is, let's look at Venerable Sir Lingpa's stages of the heroic mind just briefly. So there are three problems that you can have when you first start to learn and encounter Dharma. You're trying to internalize it and absorb it, right? The big three are that you hear something from a teacher or you read something in a book, and within a few days you forget it. It's gone. It's as though you never read it at all. It's as though you didn't attend the teaching at all. And as many people have said, Buddhism is really, in general, not something that you can learn by osmosis. You actually have to, I like to say, Buddhism is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. There's a lot that's made out of things like blessing and the blessing of the lineage, and those things are valid. At the same time, when you look at the actual behavior from day to day of greatly realized beings, I mean, His Holiness meditates for hours a day, does sadhana practice for hours a day in the morning before he gets on with his day. He also studies various texts over and over and over and over again, studies them every day or almost every day. And that type of example is something that's found across the board, really. There are very few greatly realized lamas that are known lamas who don't display some type of behavior like this, where they engage in extensive practice each day and extensive study. The study is not somehow like, who cares about study? I'm a great meditator now. No. Even like Diglo Khyentse Rinpoche, for example, the main mentor for Dzongso Rinpoche, even though he was a greatly realized Dzogchen practitioner, even though he was widely regarded as an astonishing scholar, Dzongso Rinpoche says that through to the end of his life, he continued to read, continued to study, continued to attend teachings with other teachers, and would ask questions to clarify his own understandings of those teachers, into the advanced years of his life. All of the great beings that I've studied and trained with had the ability to quote other great masters from memory. So, in general then, one needs to really spend time clarifying their understandings of these subjects. And the study and the practice sort of dichotomy isn't actually a dichotomy. If you don't understand what you're doing, you're probably not doing it. And you really need to consider that extremely carefully. If you don't know what you're doing, you probably aren't actually doing the practice, because these practices have to do with understanding what's going on, having a high level of discernment with regards to what's going on. If you can't discern what's happening, then you haven't actually done the thing yet. This is an extremely important point. These aren't revelations from a deity out there somewhere floating in the ether, or somehow, utterly transcending all ways of expressing everything. These are types of understandings that are comprehensible. Sometimes they're beyond words if the other person hasn't had the experience. But that's really talking about the extreme late stages of this training. Everything that happens before that, all the bhavana, all of the mental development, all of what the Tibetans would call familiarization, up to about the level of calm abiding and beyond, is entirely within the realm of language. And if you can't explain it to someone, then you probably don't get it. You probably don't actually understand that part of the teaching. And if you don't understand it, there's zero chance, none, not a single bit of a chance that you have realized it. And we'll talk about that. So the three faults of a vessel are that you forget. The second is that the vessel is cracked, right? Oh, I'm sorry. The first is that the vessel is overturned, rather. So you attend the teaching, but you don't listen. You're reading a book on calm abiding, but you're watching a movie and you're fiddling with your phone at the same time, and so you don't remember any of it. The second one is that it's cracked, i.e., you forget what you heard or read. The third is that the vessel is filled with so much crap that despite holding the teaching, despite the teaching going in, it gets mixed with things that basically make the teaching not work, right? So it's like pouring medicine into a vessel that has poison in it. Well, you have the medicine now, but you can't take it, right? And so Venerable Shalingpa says, through learning, i.e. studying, hearing, reading, listening, the vessel is righted, it's turned upwards. Through reflection, i.e. contemplation, analysis, reflection, the broken vessel is repaired. In other words, you will be able to remember what you heard if you spend time ruminating about it, analyzing it, thinking about it. Third, through meditation, the tainted vessel is cleaned. So those mental states, those motivations, basically the bullshit that you bring into the teaching, and your understanding of the teachings, in essence, the 8 worldly concerns, can be subdued through actually training the mind in the stages that you've heard, until you go from having a mere word understanding to having a thoroughly contemplated understanding, to having what they would call a contrived realization, which means that if you spend time really thinking about all the points of a particular topic, you can genuinely generate the realization that is that topic. And third, that you just have that realization all the time, i.e. you no longer have to think through some extensive process like, yes, the teacher is all Buddhas wouldn't leave their activities to be carried out by beings who don't have the capability to bring the teachings to fruition in the minds of beings in the same way that a Buddha does, and therefore there must be Buddhas who are still teaching. The Bodhisattvas spend countless eons cultivating compassion, i.e. they could not simply leave the teaching of the Dharma to beings who don't have the same realizations that they do. Yada, yada, yada. So you don't have to go through this extensive process to generate the first realization of the path in your mind where you go, wow, it may be the case that some teachers are great bodhisattvas and Buddhas today. You don't have to go through all of that. As soon as you think of a teacher that is your teacher, automatically the understanding occurs. Not only the understanding, but the feeling. The way of relating with them, the way of seeing that being is automatically the correct mode of perception. That's the uncontrived, unconstructed, or spontaneous realization of the topic. Having done that with regards to a whole host of Lam-Rim topics or steps and stages kinds of training methods, all of the sort of screwed up motivations and faulty ways of engaging with teachers and Dharma teachings and so on, and her own practice, are cleaned out of the vessel. And now the medicine in the vessel is pure rather than poisoned. So that's the sort of general presentation. Now let's go through the points one by one, and then we will go over them one final time at the end. So what is the first stage? The first stage is hearing, listening, reading, studying. So this encompasses all your activities that have to do with hearing the Dharma or seeing the Dharma in any form. So if you're reading a book, if you're watching a YouTube video, if you're listening to a podcast, if you're reading a practice manual, all of these sorts of things that have to do with just becoming more, for lack of a better term, academically or intellectually familiar with the teaching. That is hearing, right? That's what this means. Traditionally, it's been called hearing because for, 600 years or so, the Buddhist teachings were just hearing. If you wanted to know them, someone needed to tell you, and then you needed to memorize it because you weren't going to write it down, right? These were oral teachings for almost 600 years, thereabout. So, obviously today, these are not strictly oral teachings anymore, although there are oral-only teachings in Buddhism where the only stream of certain types of teachings is in the oral tradition versus the textual tradition. So this first step, how is it accomplished? This is quite important. It's not just the Gelug monasteries that are like this. If you were in some Chinese Buddhist environments, frankly, people don't think about this very much, but this is one of the texts written and compiled by Hakuan Zenji, the founder of Rinzai Zen. I can't remember how many texts he has, something like 28, maybe more. So if you think that Zen doesn't have an academic or intellectual component, I think that requires some analysis. This is one of the compilations of the teachings of, my brain totally spaced, of Venerable Dogen, right? Who is the sort of great master, one of the great masters of the Soto Zen tradition. So if you think that Soto doesn't have a bit of an academic or intellectual component, I think that requires some examination. And the exact same thing goes for the Pali traditions. I mean, the commentarial traditions for the Pali canon are astonishing. Venerable Buddhaghosa's commentaries, quite in depth. If you haven't at least glossed The Path of Purification, written I think in the 4th century, it's worth a read for anyone of any Buddhist tradition. It's one of the earliest commentaries on the Pali Canon, but again, big thick book. That book is taking commentaries from previous generations and compiling commentaries and the Pali Canon to make his sets of arguments. So really incredible. There's also an earlier one, 2nd or 3rd century. Same thing. I can't remember the name of that particular scholar, but the commentaries on these teachings are just astonishing. And by and large, things like the Abhidharma literature are commentarial. This is why there's multiple versions of Abhidharma. So if you think that early Buddhists, for lack of a better term, were just like sitting around doing mindfulness retreats all the time, and that was their practice, you need to look at that again. We could have a long discussion about the modern mindfulness movement for another day. On another day, for sure. The thing to consider is that Buddhism really from the beginning has been for lack of a better term, extremely erudite tradition of mental development. Of course, in the Gelug tradition, which stems from the Nalanda tradition, the emphasis on memorization cannot be understated. In the Gelug tradition, you memorize huge numbers of texts. And you memorize those texts, in a lot of cases, somewhat explicitly not understanding what it is you've read. It's the Italian aria. You have no clue what it means. You understand some of the words, but liturgical Tibetan, as I understand, it's not like normal spoken Tibetan. So a lot of what you're saying, you literally don't understand in the beginning. Now, there's also extensive practices in Gelug monasteries, really in Buddhist monasteries in general, of doing the recitations of texts, which is just frankly something that most lay people don't do. How many lay people in the course of a couple of years are going to recite the Heart Sutra 400 times? Not me. And I work pretty hard at this. Just frankly, most lay people aren't going to carry out these activities that the Japanese would call learning by body, or some theorists might call high context learning, where the very environment of learning itself is training you in the Buddhist path. So because we're not doing that, because we're not doing constant recitation of these texts, because we're not spending 6 or 8 hours, at least 6 days a week, engaged in a formal debate process based upon the things that we've memorized, we have to do something as lay people, if we're serious, to not only remember the teachings, but also achieve step 2, to contemplate them and understand all the connections in the various elements of the teaching. So what I've prepared here is a way of learning that should concord with almost anyone living almost anywhere in the world who has received a modern type of education. Given that modern education works in this way, it should feel quite natural. It should also feel that it should be somewhat demanding. It shouldn't be super easy. Let me make this bigger for people at home. So, step 1, hearing, listening, reading, studying. What is the purpose of this? The purpose of this is just to not forget the teaching, just to not forget what you've heard. If you forget it, nothing else is going to happen. So how do you study in such a way that you don't forget what you've heard? should be day one of almost any sort of Lamrim stages of the path presentation for lay people. There are a lot of reading skills in particular, now that we're a reading-driven culture, that are perhaps not as heavily emphasized in traditional Buddhist environments where the focus has been on oral transmissions and oral sort of ways of memorizing, right? Lots of tools for the auditory system. By and large, modern Western education and global modern education is driven by the visual more so than the auditory. We read texts, we analyze texts, we do our homework in a visual format with text and visual examples and so on. And we do have teachers explaining things to us, but primarily we're driven by the textual type of analysis. And so the tools that I'm going to give you here are geared towards this way of learning that you already do quite a bit of. So, step one. If you'd like to improve your reading comprehension, these are some tools that you can use. Okay? So first, when you encounter a new subject, a new text, one thing you can do to dramatically increase your comprehension is to try to get a sense of what the whole chapter, or in some cases the whole text, is all about before reading the text. That gives your mind a framework, a scaffolding, to then start building things onto, right? It gives you something stable in your head to then start adding pieces onto. If you don't have that, it's just a big jumble of information that's all new. So one way to generate this sort of scaffolding right from the beginning, or this sort of, frame for the building that you're trying to build, is to read the introduction of the text. If you read the introduction before you start the text, it will give you generally a big outline for the text. That's a big part of doing introductions. Also, you can go and you can read the final parts of the text, which quite often are doing the same thing. Usually concluding parts of chapters, opening parts of chapters are the place where you find sort of the cliff notes for the whole bit of material that you've been reading. So if you start with those, rather than reading them in order, then you create this framework to be able to start doing the work, right? So if there's an abstract or an introduction or sort of an opening section for a chapter, read that first, and then stop and go to the end and read the conclusion, read the last section of that chapter or that book, as the case may be. Then start with a skim. Rather than doing the whole text super deep, start with a skim. You've built a framework in your head. Here's kind of what this is about. Now go through the text and see if you can just identify, yes, okay, here's piece 1, here's piece 2, here's piece 3. Yes, just like they said in the introduction, it really is about pieces 1, 2, and 3. Great, got that now. Now, you start to dive deeper after you've built this sort of framework and hung a couple of pieces of sheetrock on the interior, right? Now you can start really filling in the gaps and start painting and putting on your wallpaper and whatever else you'd like to do. Prior to doing that, once again, all you have is a bunch of building materials in a big pile in your head, and until you give it some structure, it's going to be very difficult to retain much of what you've read and in some cases heard. Some other tricks of the trade, if you ever do academic work at a high level, they teach you all sorts of little tricks to make information really stick in your mind when you read it. One of them is something called sub-vocalization. So sub-vocalization is when you don't speak while you're reading, but you say the words in your mind as if you were speaking. So you're reading, if it's a product, then it's impermanent. And instead of just seeing the words with your eyes, in your head you say, if it's a product, then it's impermanent, as though you were saying it out loud. And because of that, you actually engage more of your neural structure, more pathways are created. Because you don't only have this visual thing that you saw, you also have the memory of, in essence, having the tactile sensations and the auditory sensations of having said it and having heard it, despite not actually having said it and heard it. And so, therefore, you've created 2 or 3 pathways mentally to the same information rather than just the one, just the visual. So, in terms of comprehension, which is sort of the long way of saying, do you remember what you read? The second thing you can do is take notes. And note-taking is a skill. Note-taking is not something natural. It's not something that we just do and we're good at it. Everyone takes notes, really, at various times in their lives to various levels of effectiveness. And you can improve the way that you take notes so that your notes then become an instrument that you can use to do stuff with, do things with later. And so, once again, drawing from my academic background, finished a master's, working on a doctorate, these are some of the tricks of the trade. So one of the most important things in terms of comprehension is, while you're reading something, to take notes on it in such a way that it's as though you're summarizing the material down to the most critical points that you hope to keep in your mind at that level of the reading, right? And one of the keys with this is don't dumb it down. Don't, especially in this day and age, don't try to put everything into your own words. If you've come across something critical that you don't understand, don't rewrite it in a way that makes the information dumber. Just write it down the way that it is. At a later stage in using your notes, you can then start to, quote unquote, dumb it down. Or you can try to explain it in a way that's not so dense in terms of the language. But do not, despite everything you've heard, just try to write stuff in your own words. That is a recipe to really never understand any of this material in a deep way. You need to write it down the way that it is. So this means taking direct quotes out of the text. That being said, my preferred method of note-taking is digital. If you do your notes in a digital format, they will be so much more useful to you than if you do them in an analog format written down on paper. I would show you all of my analog notes from college years and years of Dharma things. Big fat stack of old Dharma notes. Do you know how many times I've read all those notes? How many times I've reused that material, reflected on it in a second time in a deep way? If I'm being honest, I can count, I think, on one hand the number of times I've gone over that material again in any way, shape, or form. Because what happens? What happens? This happens to all of us. You take the notes, and then you got the kids, you've got the job, you've got the academic stuff you're working on, you've got gardening to do, you've got the party to plan. And all of a sudden, oh, it's Thursday again. And I've got to take notes in this Dharma class that I'm in again. So you take the notes. And you're like, yes, eventually I'll get back to these and I'll read these. And then there's the job and the kids and the thing and the other thing. And you never read the notes. Maybe you reflect on them a little bit before class and then, just so that you kind of know what's going on, and you reflect on them like 10 minutes before class starts, and then you get back into class and you never read them again. Right? So the level of use that you get out of those notes is basically freaking nothing. So you wasted a huge amount of time putting a bunch of stuff into your own words that you're never going to read again, basically. Why? Don't do that. Here's what you should do, in my opinion. Take your notes in a digital format. Whether you're attending a teaching live, or you're attending a teaching online, or you're reading a book. Why? Fundamentally, here's the reason why. If you take all your notes in a digital format, this gives you the ability over the course of 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, a lifetime, every single time you attend a teaching on calm abiding, on preciousness of a human rebirth, on the correct relationship, the mentor-student relationship in Buddhism. You name the topic. If you've already attended a teaching once on that, you have all of this right at your fingertips. Before you attend the teaching again, you know what questions that were left unanswered in your mind 4 years ago when you got this teaching last time. You know sort of what the level of understanding you had was previously. You can now take notes in the new retreat that you're in, and you can take all of this material that you gathered 2 years ago, 3 years ago, or over the course of 10 years, and you put it in one place, and you start to digest it, which is something we're going to talk about in stage 2. So when you take notes, in particular if you're reading and taking notes, be extremely generous with the material. Type out a huge amount of the material. Consider this to be your version of recitation. Consider this to be your version of memorization, even though we're not putting it in our own mind, right? Take big chunks of the text where you go, wow, this is the way to explain it, where it really sticks. Wow, I really get it that way. When Yangtze Rinpoche talks about the preciousness of a human rebirth, oh wow, the way that he explains it really gets it into my mind. So you put his version into your notes, right? Perhaps when you read the Lamrim Chenmo and you're reading the same points, because they were written for a 14th or 15th century audience, maybe it doesn't strike you in the same way. Doesn't mean you don't include Je Tsongkhapa's way of explaining it, but in any case, I think you can see the point. You're taking big chunks of the text, those parts that really, really move your mind personally. And if Je Tsongkhapa's way of explaining it in the Chenmo doesn't move your mind, then the teaching isn't functioning to generate the realization that is the teaching right now, today, in your mind. And so it's better to use an explanation, maybe created by Yangtze Rinpoche, maybe created by Lama Sopa, or Lama Zopa Rinpoche, or somebody who lived in the last 100 years, who is speaking to a more modern audience. Pabongka Rinpoche, in the last 200 years, as I explained before, some of his explanations, they just strike me. They really strike me when I read them, in a way that Je Tsongkhapa's don't. Not that his teachings aren't moving and important, they are. But when you take notes, take notes and bring in the things that really, really move you and drive you, while also trying to keep the structure of the text itself. So if the text has 4 points on the mentor-student relationship, then you need to have 4 points in your notes, and you need to define each of these critical points. And don't define them in your own words. Use the definitions from the text. And then 2 years from now, when you're doing a retreat on Lam Rim, and they start talking about the mentor-student relationship, you pull up your notes, and there's a question that you wrote down from 2 years ago about, well, why is it that such and such and such? And you have a geshe who's sitting there quite kindly explain to you why it is such and such, right? So this is how these notes start to function in your training. So extended outline notes. What do you take notes on? So in terms of note-taking in a skillful way, generally the advice is to take notes on the main points and the main terms. So how do you know what the main points and terms are? Well, generally, if you read the introductory remarks and introductions, summaries, you'll find that the main points are listed out somewhere. Also, throughout the text as you're reading, you're going to find all of these signal words and phrases. So you'll find things like the four main so-and-so, or to sum up, or the major reason why, or my opponent says X, but we're saying not X, or we're saying Y, because, you know, basically, when you find these sort of trigger phrases and trigger words, it's because the author is really trying to communicate to you, this is the thing. I'm giving it to you. Here's the thing that you really need to take away. And basically, if you look for those keywords and you look for the four main, the three main, the six main, and so on, you're going to be able to construct an outline in your notes that very much concords with what you're reading. Also, something good to point out is that sometimes in a text you'll find that certain critical terms are repeated. And even though that may not be amongst the, let's say, the four critical points of the student-teacher relationship, that a certain theme or idea or way of explaining something is said again and again and again, although it's not really earmarked as being special. Those can be quite helpful to take notes on. Small example of this, I attended a course with Geshe Namdak, where he said that sometimes in the presentation of Precious Human Rebirth, they point out that also, not only do you have all these conditions that are quite favorable to training the mind and so on, but also you have the time to train. So this is one of your endowments or your opportunities, is that you actually have the time to do this work. And I thought, that's interesting. And so I started looking around to figure out, well, who said that? Who added that? Where is that added? How is it explained when it's sort of written down in a more formal way? And I found out that actually that's one of J. Pabonka's additions to the tradition. And it's not formalized, and you actually have to read quite a few of J. Pabonka's texts to find this point. But he says in one text, I think his Lam Rim, Liberation in the Palm of Your Hands, he says, basically, how foolish would you be, having found yada, yada, yada conditions, if you didn't use the time that you have, because you have the time. And then in some other text that he wrote, commenting on J. Pabonka's Three Principal Aspects of the Path, Preparing for Tantra is the text, he, on the other hand, he says, so that would be one of your opportunities, right? The previous. One of the things that is a condition that you're free from, right? One of your freedoms is that you're not overwhelmed in such a way that you don't have the time to practice. You see? And so in the 8 freedoms and 10 opportunities, he has actually 9 freedoms and 11 opportunities. So there are 20 points instead of 18 if you follow the oral tradition passed on by J. Pabonka. But J. Pabonka doesn't himself say, yes, I'm adding this in. But apparently the oral tradition is so strong at this point that, there are Gelug Geshes who occasionally teach this point as sort of an adjunct, an add-on to the tradition, that, yes, make sure that you don't forget. It's actually kind of a big deal that you could have every other condition and yet still be entirely too busy with your life to do the training. So in that way, there may be repeated words or concepts or things that are sort of earmarked that are not part of the main presentation of a text, and nonetheless they're extremely important. And so if you find those little nuggets of goodness in the teachings, and in particular if they really move you and you go, wow, yes, that's astonishing. I can't believe that I have this time to do this. So many people don't have the time. And if that moves you, definitely put it in your personal notes, because your notes are for you, right? They're for you as a training tool. So in brief, identify the most relevant information, write it down, write down keywords and phrases, There are also, if it's relevant to the topic at hand, and you have the mind for these types of details, dates, names, the names of certain types of theories, the definitions of terms, all of these things are extremely helpful. When you're quoting, however, large portions of text in particular, so that you're creating a very, very robust resource for yourself, it can be very helpful to do, again, the academic thing of removing filler words and phrases. This really helps when you're trying to read things later and get it to stick in your mind. For example, I made this little sentence just for fun. So in some texts, you find stuff like this. It says, like the other side said, such as it is, the opponent says that in some circumstances, when convenient to his point, yes. Affirmative. So sometimes you find this big setup really that is only saying, as I've shortened it to here, you're really only saying that the opponent says yes to a particular point. So what do you need to take notes on here? Well, you don't need all of this filler stuff, right? You just need, regarding point A, the opponent says yes, right? That's all you need. You don't need the sort of conversational elements that have been added for effect. And then when you're trying to remember this later, trying to remember, and under some circumstance, blah, 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 you're not going to remember that. What you can remember quite easily is, with regards to affirming negations, in the tantric traditions, the opponent says no, we say yes. Easy, right? So, in general, for your note-taking, I've said some of this already, but you want to cover all the critical issues of each chapter, each section, each subsection of a chapter. You do not need to reinvent the wheel, in particular if you're only 5 to 10 years into the process. Just use the structure that's already in the text. You can even copy the very headings from the book or the article that you're reading and use those to structure your own notes on the topic. Very likely what you'll find is that if you're working in the Kagyu tradition, that most of the outlines for the Kagyu tradition's stages of the path will be quite similar. And so when you go to take notes on another text and start to inject them into sort of one master document and so on, you'll find that, yes, the headings from the other book are quite similar to this one. And this will really, really start to help build this structure of understanding in your mind. Let's see. Yes, so if a syllabus or a set of slides or an outline is already provided to you for the material, then build an outline document. Build an outline document for whatever course you're taking. So this then goes beyond simply reading books, right? But a lot of us in the Dharma world, we attend a lot of retreats. And if not retreats, we're involved in some kind of course where we spend a year or 2 years or 5 years or whatever, going from point A to point B or Z or whatever in the teachings. Most of those courses these days, they include a reading list, or if not a reading list, they'll have assigned readings between course dates. And something that will dramatically change your comprehension is outlining the readings as notes before the next teaching. Not only does this give you the ability to go back and read a very abbreviated version of the text that you're covering later on, which increases comprehension and memory, but also you have this structure now so that as the teacher is going through point A, point B, point C, no matter how they explain it verbally, you have the textual version of this to follow along, and you know exactly where in the structure of the outline of the work that they are. So you're not going to get lost as they're talking through, maybe 15 or 17 points in the course of an hour or 2 hours. You know exactly where you are in the material, right? This is very important, very, very important for long-term growth and comprehension in terms of these teachings. Finally, very important to keep your notes highly organized. Keep your references, your reference materials highly organized. I like to say, essentially imagine that you're working on writing a book, and the end product must be a highly professional type of end product. And this is not to say that you should imagine yourself writing a bunch of books. What this is really saying is that you want the quality of your notes to be such that, if someone were to stumble on them at a later time, they would go, wow, there's not much to do here except change the format of this, and this could be a book or a text. Why do you want your notes to be that organized, that well thought through? Because the process of doing that for you is going to replace reciting the text 400 times. It's going to replace memorizing the text. It's going to replace debating the text 6 hours a day or discussing it with teachers and mentors over and over and over again for years. Because for most of us, that's not the reality. We're not going to get in so many private audiences with our teachers and mentors and be able to exchange so many emails that they're going to clear up all of our understandings like feeding a baby with a spoon. It's going to happen like this. You have to do the work yourself. So build your notes with the highest possible quality that you can. Build your notes with the most professional quality that you can, so that when you go back and read those notes, they are an astonishing resource for yourself. Where if somebody has a question of you that you don't know the answer to, the first instinct you have after 5 or 6 years of doing this is to go to your notes, where you have the written oral instructions from 2 or 3 retreats on the topic, where you've pulled material from 6 different lam rims and you've put them in one place and it's all there right at hand, right? That's what this resource should become, not yet another notebook filled with scribbled crap sitting in your closet. It has no function whatsoever, right? So another thing that I recommend is this. Make a bibliography and put citations in your work as you go. This will slow you down. Why do I recommend this? I recommend this because, frankly, if you want to be able to combine multiple resources into one place, it is unbelievably useful mentally to know immediately where a piece of information came from, and especially if you're taking notes digitally over a long period of time, to be able to then go back to the text without wasting a lot of time and go exactly to that place in the text and get more information. For example, perhaps in your haste, in your sort of lack of understanding of the material on the first couple of passes through, you didn't take very good notes, make a very good structure or what have you on the topic of subtle impermanence, right? Maybe you were more of an emptiness guy at that point, or you thought everything was all about compassion and love and you don't know why you're doing this. And so the quality of the notes just frankly wasn't that good because your motivation wasn't that good. Maybe 6 or 7 years later, you've completely turned around and now you're thinking, impermanence is really, really important. I have to get this subtle impermanence thing. You go back to your notes and they're crap. However, they're not entire crap because you have the page numbers in the Lam Rim Chenmo or Venerable Rinpoche's Practicing the Path, or Geshe Lundra Sopa's ginormous commentary on the Lam Rim Chenmo, etc. And you have all of the places where you pulled these little nuggets of correct information, even though you didn't get everything you needed. So you don't have to start over. You can go back to the text right to where you missed the key information, reread those couple of pages, adjust the quotations in your notes, and make them stronger, make them more complete. You see? And so this tool becomes just an astonishing one for your own understanding, because you can see where your understanding is, where it was, where it is, and to a degree where it's going, right? So this tool provides you with a lot of feedback in an ongoing way. Guarantee you, if you write notes today and you read them 5 years from now, you're going to be like, wow. In some places you go, wow, I can't believe I got that 5 years ago. And in some places you go, whoa, I was so far off 5 years ago. And so this gives you feedback internally as to what's going on with your own understanding and realizations. Key point on citing your work. If you wait until the very end, for example, I'll show you this. So if you wait until the very end of a work to do your citations, there's basically no chance that you're going to remember where in the text everything came from. There's basically no chance you're going to remember what texts that they came from and so on if you're using more than a couple of texts. So the recommendation from the academic side is always to basically build your reference material as you go, right? So actually, I don't need to show you that. We'll just stick with this. So in these notes, for example, at the end, I have a bibliography. I don't want to jump down there because who knows what's going to happen with my with my notes that I'm actually showing you. But in any case, build a bibliography with all of the texts that you're using, all the articles that you're using, all the links to the articles that you've read, and then you know exactly where you got the information. You know exactly what teacher was teaching the information. You know when it was taught. And in a lot of cases, if you're pulling out a direct quote, you know, here's the text, here's the page number. If you need more information, you can go right back to it. Next, lecture notes. So, lecture notes. When you're basically, what I recommend is this. When you're in this note-taking sort of mode, here in the hearing phase, in the listening phase, again, most courses these days, most Buddhist teaching these days, they have some type of assigned reading ahead of time. And if they don't have assigned reading, there are texts on the subject of anything that you're going to get into in Dharma, ready and available out there. And they're available out there in your denomination or your system of Buddhism. Buy it and read the text prior to going on the retreat. And build this outline like we've been discussing. Build this outline for the at least sort of the taught part of the retreat. If it's a meditative retreat, this may not be an appropriate practice. But a lot of retreats are study retreats, and this is entirely appropriate. And then once you attend the lecture, right, now you can start to fill in things with all the little bits and sort of nougats that make the understanding alive for you. This is, I think, the most profound thing that happens when you study Buddhism with a realized person, or you study Buddhism even with a scholar who doesn't have a lot of realization perhaps, but has been striving for a long time in the system. You will get key details that you missed, or you thought you understood, but you didn't at all get, right? Because some key term didn't mean what you thought it meant. And so in your notes, you go, okay, here's the key term. You pull it out from the quote that you already have, and you define the key term. Geshe Namdak 2022 said that direct inferential cognition can be valid or invalid in the Svatantrika, whatever, right? That may be not true. In any case, you get the point. If in the course of sitting in a lecture you have a novel insight into some aspect of the teaching, this I like to have a journal section, right? So in your notes you also have a journal, where you're related to that topic, you're writing your own thoughts out, you're sort of talking yourself through stuff, but it's not the notes from the lecture, right? This is an important point. I try as much as I can, although I'm quite bad at this. I think maybe because I've been doing this a while and maybe I'm a bit arrogant about it. But as much as you can, it's best to sort of separate your own thoughts on what you're hearing into sort of a journal section in your notes, and then to have the proper sort of notes on the lecture itself in a different section. At some point you might bring these together, but it's good to sort of have your teacher's thoughts on the one hand and your thoughts on the other. In terms of lecture notes, sometimes you'll have a novel insight. For example, you're studying calm abiding, but somehow it triggers something having to do with ethics that you read in the lives of Kadam masters, for example, and you go, oh wow, that's what Geshe Patoa meant. Oh yes, I got it. So in your journal section, you just put it there quickly so that you don't forget, you have it for later, and then you continue on. Oftentimes in oral transmission of the teachings, there are analogies, anecdotes, sort of novel comparisons, stories that are coming from the teacher's experience, or just the wealth of stuff the teacher has collected in terms of how to explain these teachings, some of which are really going to make the teaching come alive for you. And those are the sorts of things during teachings: key details, novel insights, ways of explaining it in terms of analogy, comparison, anecdote, story, as well as original material. There, for example, like I said, Geshe Namdak mentioned this point about, well, in the precious human rebirth teachings, sometimes we also talk about this thing of, we don't, a lot of people don't have enough time to practice, and you're free from that condition. You do have the time to practice. And that led me down a sort of quite a journey to find, well, who said this? Where is this coming from? How is it explained sort of in those teachings in and of themselves? And it was extremely rewarding to do that, extremely rewarding. And so you'll find these bits of novel or original material coming from a teacher's experience or the oral tradition during lecture. And that's what you should be taking notes on. Frankly, ahead of the course, ahead of the teaching, you should already have an outline of the material. Do not, if you're sitting in the class outlining the material, you might as well have just read the book. I mean, the book has all that. What the book doesn't have is this. It doesn't have these key details that you couldn't get from the text, nor the anecdotes, nor the stories, nor the comparisons, nor the analogies, nor the little bits of original material, nor the oral tradition itself that carries a certain je ne sais quoi, right? A certain X factor that is not generally something that you get from a text. So in the same way, if you use a standardized citation format, you can actually take your notes as sort of an oral transmission or an what do they call it? They call it personal communication a lot of times, but I think that really sucks. It's not quite a personal communication, is it, when you're going to a Dharma teaching? In some ways it is. That's just a terrible way of explaining it, I think. In any case, you can cite your own notes in the synthesis portion of the work, what is more traditionally called contemplation, analysis, or reflection, right? This is quite helpful also because then you can separate in your sort of master documents that we'll talk about probably in the next video. You can separate, well, here's what my teacher said, here's what at least what I heard my teacher say in 2021. Here's what the text says. Here's the key details they added and an analogy that really makes it stick in my head. Boom, right? And you've synthesized this all into one place. And now here's my thought on it also, right? And you can keep each of these pieces separate with a citation so you know exactly where they came from. If you don't have a citation, it's your thoughts. If you have a citation, Namdak 2022, then you know this is from the course you were doing in 2022 with Geshe Namdok. This isn't just your own musings on the reading that you did from before. So even citing your own lecture notes in sort of the master documents that you create with your notes, where you're synthesizing notes from a bunch of places, can be quite helpful for that reason. We've already talked about journal. So the journal is questions, novel connections you've noted, or maybe you have a counterpoint that you want to be able to recall later on where the teacher's talking and you go, when I was reading so-and-so, it said this. So respectfully, I need to ask, does compassion have an object, or is compassion objectless? Right? And a well-trained Geshe will have a well-trained answer for that question. So then, when you get into the retention phase and you're reviewing, some of these things from the journal can be removed, or maybe you'll move them to some other digital place that they're a better fit, right? Like, for example, I said, hey, wow, this really triggers this thing on ethics from when I was reading Patoa. And maybe you attended a teaching on Patoa's Kadampa teachings. And so you take this thought about ethics that you learned in this calm abiding retreat and you move it over to your notes on Patoa. And so there again, you have this constantly increasing process of sort of digitally cataloging where you are in terms of your understanding of Dharma. So far we've really just been talking about, okay, you're attending a course or you're reading a book and you're trying to just gather the material digitally in one place. Then the question is, okay, now you've gathered it in one place, how do you remember it all? Again, the traditional sort of approach is generally memorize it or recite it over and over and over and over and over again. I think that, again, most lay people, despite their strong aspirations to really do something and really sort of get the Dharma, because that's such a foreign process of learning, aren't going to do that. And frankly, I don't know of anyone that I've met who learned the Dharma as a lay person in that way. So, as I said here, in terms of review, this is an extremely important part of the process. So the outlining method that I've described for you here is in some ways a poor one if you are going to do it as a standalone exercise. The way that I'm describing it, it's not a standalone exercise. It is the creation of a resource that you continually return to. There was a study published in 2014, basically, that said, if students are taking notes on a laptop, they have impaired learning outcomes. And the technique that I'm describing to you is basically this one that has a poorer outcome than learning either by simply sitting and listening or learning by, again, sort of taking notes and putting it on your own words and doing all the traditional stuff. So why am I recommending a method that's inferior? It's a great question. The reason I'm recommending this method is it's not meant to be employed in the way that sort of your standard notes, which frankly most people never read a second time, would be employed, right? The standard note-taking method, you take these notes in a way that you kind of get, oh yeah, there's a trigger thing here, and here's the way I can remember it, and here's my anagram for this point and all that. And you read it like once or twice, and then you never read it again. So in terms of that tool being used in that way, fine. If you want to use your notes in that way, fine. It'll work okay. People can get through pretty hefty academic requirements in that way. But you guys hear my dog back there? Hey, buddy. I'm doing a video. Sorry for the digression. Oh, so the outline method and the note-taking method for lectures that I'm describing is not meant to be used as a one-off pass the quiz at an undergraduate level, pass the test, be able to answer the question the teacher asks you next Tuesday kind of method. This is a completely different approach for a completely different problem. Dharma is something that you do for your whole life. Dharma is an understanding that, to borrow a turn of phrase from one of my Tai Chi mentors, it's an inch wide and a mile deep. It is not a mile wide and an inch deep. You don't study all this stuff and just get the topsoil and you're done. Dharma, you start with some term that you think is insignificant on day one, and you never leave that term. And it's just goes on for a mile, down and down and down and down. And these understandings build on each other, and the connections that term has to other terms build on each other. And so the outlining method and the note-taking method I'm describing for you is for that type of process, where you are going to return to the material again and again and again and again. And the material is basically never going to get wider. It's just going to get deeper. You following? So in terms of short-term retention using this method, which is an important part of the process, there are some tools that you can use. The most critical thing is, if you take notes on a text, if you take notes in a lecture, you need to come back to that material within 24 hours. Ideally, within 1 hour, you need to review the notes that you took. If you don't, you're going to lose a huge amount of the material. Within 24 hours, you're going to forget 40% of what you heard or read at a minimum. And after 48 hours, you're going to lose 60%. You can cut those numbers down dramatically and get the information to start staying in the old noggin by just reviewing what you already wrote. So, how do we start the process of a mile-deep analysis of the material? Well, we can start it with recitation, which is a traditional sort of Buddhist thing to do. And then we're going to carry on by doing an enriching exercise, reorganizing, synthesizing, generating questions, and analysis. At the end of this process, whatever you have studied, if you have the time to carry out these steps, will almost without a doubt be stuck in your head at least for a year. And some of it will be stuck in your head for the rest of your life if you just sort of refresh it here and there by looking at the topic. And again, this is of course not the monastic approach and not the traditional Buddhist approach, but it matches the way of learning that you've already spent your entire lifetime engaged in. So this initial phase, as I say here, having to do with hearing, listening, reading, studying, is about retention, mostly about retention. So I don't want to lose the primary function of step one in my presentation. And because I'm giving you a method that is a long-term technique that is not as favorable to retention, I feel an obligation to really circle around and talk about, okay, well, how do we use this technique nonetheless to increase retention, right? Because that's the point of step one, or stage one, rather. So the best thing you can do for retention, the best thing that almost anyone can do for retention is recitation. And this is not the type of recitation that is merely the verbal repetition of what you have heard, which you can do mindlessly. This is explanation, right? This is an extremely profound tool. You take your notes, you start at page 1, you look at what's been pulled out of the text in the outline phase, and you look at what's been added by your teacher in terms of anecdotes, notes, stories, narratives, you name it, and then you recite it. You recite it as though you're explaining it to someone who is competent in the material. So you're not dumbing it down. You're not trying to make it so easy that a 9-year-old could get it. You're explaining it with its full integrity intact, as though you're explaining it to someone else who already understands the material, right? So as you go through the material, you say, well, yes, emptiness entails that compassion must be objectless because the object of compassion is also empty. Blah, 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 blah. Where you find that you have a gap and you go, oh, well, if they're empty, does that mean that they're not there at all? And that's why there's no object of the compassion? You go, no, that can't be right, because if no one was there at all, that would mean that compassion made no sense. Why would I have compassion for things that don't exist? And so where you find a gap and you go, wow, I really must not comprehend this point, you go back and you try to fill it in. So if you're going through a portion on objectless compassion in the text, well, now you go back to that portion in the text. By the way, you know exactly the page number it's on because you already did that part of the work, didn't you? And you look at your teacher's analogies again and you go, okay, yeah, I see. Oh, I get it now. I've only refuted the inherent existence of sentient beings, not their mere existence, not their conventional existence. So in terms of being objectless, they're objectless in terms of not having an inherent person for whom I'm having compassion. Blah, 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 blah. And so you explain this as though you're explaining it to someone who will get it if it's explained in its full detail. And if you find a gap, you stop and you go fill it in. If you don't find a gap, you just keep on going, right? So if you're reading the material and you're explaining it out loud as though explaining it to somebody, and you don't find a gap in your understanding where you're going, and you're kind of getting hand wavy about the material, then you carry on until you get to the end of the material. If you do this recitation method within an hour of the teaching you received, you'll have maximum retention. If you review it within 24 hours, pretty good. 48 hours, a little bit less good, but better than nothing. If you review it in this way 2 or 3 times within like the week that you heard the teaching, like right away you do a little bit, and then, over the course of the next 3 or 4 days, you're continuing the process and trying to fill in gaps and do all this stuff, your retention is going to go through the roof. You're going to remember so much of the material that you've covered because you have it written down. You have the parts that really stick in your mind and move your mind written down and outlined, and you have all the little details that your teacher clarified and filled in for you, and the stories that were really punchy, the stories and the narratives and the anecdotes and the allegories and the metaphors that really, really just, for your mind, make a huge difference. All that material is right there at your fingertips. And as you go through it and recite it and explain it over the course of a few days, those understandings are going to get stickier and stickier and stickier until they're just firmly planted in your mind. So in terms of the 3-stage process that's recommended in the really recommended starting from the Kadampa tradition. From what I can tell, I haven't found it earlier than the Kadampas. This first step of just not forgetting what you heard the volume can be turned up from like a 2 to a 12 by using the tools that you already have from your academic learning in a Western context. In brief, what I covered today was, in essence, what to do when you're studying a text and listening to a lecture, and how to get the most out of that text and out of that lecture, and how to start building a resource out of the material that you're getting from texts and lectures, so that over the course of time, this resource becomes better and better and better and better, and becomes one of the primary tools that you use to engage the material and sort of focus and centralize the material that you're learning on a topic. So in brief, I covered this stage 1 of hearing, listening, reading, or studying in 3 stages. The first is overview for comprehension. Overview for comprehension meant that we're looking at the introduction, we're looking at the conclusion, we're looking at the abstract, and then we're skimming and scanning to grab a few details related to what we've pulled together from the abstract, and maybe sort of fill in gaps in our outline that weren't complete. And then as we're diving deeper and we're reading the text really from start to finish, or the chapter from start to finish, we're using sub-vocalization, reading the material in your head as though you're reading it out loud, which increases comprehension. Step 2, as we're taking more detailed notes and we're sort of doing a detailed comprehension, we're taking our notes again in a digital format. We're pulling out a lot of the things that are labeled as the 4 main, the 3 main, to sum up, a major reason why, etc. We're looking for remarks in the introduction and the conclusion that really signal, this is the outline for this portion of the material. We're looking at trying to identify the most relevant information that may include dates, names, theories, and definitions. Almost always it includes theories and definitions. In particular, if you're a Gelug, while you're doing that, you're getting rid of extraneous material in the quotes that you're taking. So you're taking big quotes out of the material where it's relevant, but you're trying to get rid of extra words that are fillers, not real content, just fillers, so that complex sentences become simple ones without dumbing the material down. If you're doing a course where there's going to be a lecture with a teacher, one wants to cover the slides, the outline for the material, the text that's been provided, or the material in the text, that portion of the text, prior to the course beginning. You want to build your outline document and have it ready with all the key points before you start the course, so that while you're sitting in the lecture, you're just filling in critical material that you could not have gotten from the book. That's absolutely essential. The outline, the basic ideas, the basic definitions, etc., you can get from the text. So what are you doing in the lecture? In the lecture, you're getting the stuff that really moves the mind. You're clarifying critical points, anecdotes, stories, analogies, etc., that really make the material come alive, come to life for you. While you're doing all this, you're using standardized standardized formats for things like the texts that you're reading, the articles that you're pulling material from, and the lecture, right? The lecture also should have a standardized citation so that when you pull together multiple resources, which will be part of step 2, as you pull together multiple resources, that you know where everything came from, and that 6 years from now, when you're reviewing this material again, you know exactly where every piece of this information came from, whether it's your personal thoughts, or it's notes from a lecture, or it's quotations from a text. In the long haul, that's incredibly important for the development of your understanding. Also, while you're attending the lecture, you should have a journal section already prepared in your work, so that when something comes up that is sort of a small point, a critical thing, but it's not directly related, or you want to sort of inject your own thoughts into something that you think is important, or you want to write down a question for the end of the lecture, really, really bad form to sit in a lecture with an idea in your head going, okay, there's 30 minutes left. I need to remember this question. I don't want to forget, so I'm just going to keep repeating this question to myself in my head over and over and over again. That's crazy. That means you're going to miss like 50% of what the instructor is saying. In your journal section, you type out the question in 10 seconds, and then you go back to the notes and fully engage in the process of hearing what the instructor is telling you. Finally, because this method is meant for long-term growth, long-term development, and not passing a quiz next week, this is a method that is not actually ideal for retention in the short term, which means you have to adjust the use of the tool to increase comprehension to the level of tools that are better for short-term comprehension. How do you do that? Finally, what I call sort of step 3, I call it recitation. You could also call it explanation. Within an hour, certainly within 24 hours, 48 hours at the latest, you want to explain out loud all of this material verbally as though you're explaining it to a competent person that you don't have to dumb the material down for. And if you do that, then you can make all this material very, very sticky. You can make it stay in your mind. While you're explaining it, look for gaps. Look for gaps in your own understanding. You can write those in your journal section as questions for the next sort of part of the course. If there's something you don't get or you're really unsure about and you can't find it in the text, great. Next time you're with the instructor during question time, ask your question. And instructors generally really appreciate that you spent a lot of time, you thought about it, you came with a question that's relevant for your understanding or your training, and your notes just didn't get like shoved into a closet somewhere, and you're not just sitting there like a baby with its mouth open waiting to get more, applesauce. So if you find gaps, fill them in. If you can't fill them in your journal section for that sort of topic, save that for the next session with your mentor or instructor, tutor, as the case may be, so that you can get clarification. And if there's no gaps in your understanding for that part of the material, at this stage, just carry on with the explanation. This is just for retention, right? This is just an exercise for retention. So in brief, that's what we covered today. That is stage 1. That is just hearing, listening, studying, which is taking the vessel and turning it right side up, i.e. retaining the nectar that's been poured inside, not forgetting the information that you've been taught. So this process will allow you to retain, I think, the maximum amount of information from each teaching that you attend in a Buddhist setting. Next time, we're going to discuss stage 2, contemplation, analysis, or reflection. And in this section, I'm also going to talk about a bit of organization, because this section has a lot to do with synthesizing material that you've received from multiple sources, multiple teachers, multiple texts into one sort of master resource. And so this requires some back-end organization for your notes at a meta level, right? If you've attended 6 different teachings on shamatha or calm abiding, what do you do with all of the notes that you've taken in 6 different settings? Not only that, maybe you have like 14 texts on calm abiding on your shelves and you've read most of them and you have a bunch of notes on them. What do you do with that material, right? So the back end of organizing all the material so that it's easy to find, it's easy to just search and get that material right at hand is extremely important, I think, for the process of what I might call sort of maturing your intellectual understanding of the teaching. So the first step was retention. You're trying to retain the maximum amount that you get at a teaching. The second step is maturing your intellectual understanding. And then finally, generating a contrived or constructed realization, and then a direct realization. So that's the process outlined by the great Kadampas. And this is, and will continue to be, I hope, quite a helpful presentation for Westerners, in particular non-retreatants and also probably non-monastics. Though I wouldn't say that this is like irrelevant to monastics. In any case, thank you for attending or listening in at a later time if you happen to be listening in the future. In the links below, you will find a link to my Patreon. And despite feeling a bit embarrassed for having a Patreon, which a friend of mine called OnlyFans for Academics, it really is meaningful to make a contribution if it's within your means. it will support my own practice. It will support my ongoing PhD research to bring Tibetan philosophy into the classroom in Western academic settings so that more people can be exposed to these wonderful teachings.